All right, our next speaker is Lucien Greaves. He is a social activist and the spokesman and co-founder of the Satanic Temple. Greaves has appeared on numerous media outlets and has made televised appearances on Fox News Network. He is a public speaker and essayist who has contributed articles and publications including Skeptic Magazine, Skeptical Inquirer, The Washington Post, International Business Times, and the Huffington Post. Here is Ending Pseudoscience and Theocracy, Grey Faction, and the Satanic Temple by Lucien Greaves.
Hello, everybody. So I first came into public awareness, I believe, sometime not long after the Boston Marathon bombing, when I officiated a homoerotic satanic ceremony at the grave site of the founder of the Westboro Baptist Church's mother's grave. He was still alive at the time, and they credited us with one of their typical flyers, ranting and raving about how God hates fags, and it was God who brought the bombs at the Boston Marathon bombing, and that was what compelled us to go to that gravesite to begin with. As usually happens with these types of things, tragedies like the Boston Marathon bombing, the people with the most simplistic worldviews, of course, were the least confused by what had taken place. And to that end, Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist radio host, had talked on and on about how this was a false flag operation meant to take Americans' guns away, because we have this sinister network working within the international governments that, while it is the most evil force in the world and quite capable of the most deplorable deeds you can imagine, they're polite enough sometimes to not actually kill people, but stage places like Boylston Street in Boston and use actors to pretend they've gotten hurt just to meet their ends of undermining the Constitution. Similarly, the Westboro Baptist Church kind of co-opted the Boston Marathon bombing to their own ends, and were claiming that they knew exactly who brought the bombs and that it was God. And that God brought these bombs, of course, because of fags, fag marriage, transsexuals, homosexuality was going to destroy the nation. This was God's judgment upon us, and that this was a good thing, these bombs. And so God is kind of the ultimate conspiracy theory, this idea that there's one power in control of all things, and nothing can happen without the manufacturer reference to this one ultimate source. So there's really little difference between Alex Jones and the Westboro Baptist Church. But a weird thing kind of happened. People weren't aware of the Satanic Temple at that time, but when we were contrasted against something as deplorable as the Westboro Baptist Church, it seemed to make a certain amount of intuitive sense. The Westboro Baptist Church isn't so much different from organizations like the 700 Club, only they're a bit more honest about where they stand on the issues. You hear that idiotic little platitude that they, from organizations like the 700 Club and not the Westboro Baptist Church, that they hate the sin but love the sinner. But their idea of love, subjugating people and taking their lifestyle choices away from them, hardly seems like love at all. But the sheriff in Meridian, Mississippi, made a big display of claiming that our arrests were imminent and that he was going to do everything to prosecute what I had done to the fullest extent of the law. And I don't think he was counting on the backlash he got from certain media, more of the hip sources like Vice and others, who began questioning by what right would I be arrested at all, and what had actually gone wrong, and was what I had done any more offensive than anything the Westboro Baptist Church had done. And I think some of the religious right was deeply concerned to see younger people not having a knee-jerk reaction against Satanism being invoked, or the name of Satan at all. But there again, it made intuitive sense when people were looking at the Christian churches as a source of repression and absolute corruption. Sometime after that, Oklahoma passed a bill allowing for a Ten Commandments monument to go on the property of their state, of their Capitol grounds. They passed the bill saying that the Ten Commandments informed the foundation of American constitutional law, And let's not get into comparing the Constitution against the Ten Commandments and seeing how they absolutely contrast and disagree with one another. But the important part is that they were claiming that the fact that the Ten Commandments monument that they had approved was a private donation. So the Capitol grounds were then opened as a limited public forum for other private donations as well. And other private donations, you would assume, of religious significance. So we called their bluff, and we offered our own 9.5-foot tall, 1.5-ton monument to sit somewhere alongside the Ten Commandments in an effort to uphold pluralism. We were saying that the Ten Commandments monument alone on the Capitol grounds was a violation of the Establishment Clause and really ran contrary to everything our Constitution founded for us. However, if they were to set the Baphomet alongside the Ten Commandments monument, that would very much be in line with democratic pluralistic principles, and there really wouldn't be a problem at all. And we took this image of Baphomet, the part goat, part human, with the caduceus representing reconciliation, negotiation on each side, points above and below, the star pointed up on the head, inverted behind the head, and in that way we thought we were sending forward a message of reconciliation of opposites. The ACLU had already filed a lawsuit against the Ten Commandments monument, and they won. The state Supreme Court agreed that the Ten Commandments monument needed to come down, and we didn't get the opportunity to fight to have our monument put up. But we're initiating that battle now. We're going to be suing Arkansas as soon as they put up their Ten Commandments monument, because they had also refused our Baphomet monument. On the right, you see in Detroit where we had our unveiling ceremony of the Baphomet monument. And at that time, while we were planning the unveiling ceremony, we thought that we'd also be announcing our lawsuit against Oklahoma, but then the Ten Commandments came down. But it was interesting to note the chaos that broke loose when we announced that we had completed our monument and that we were going to be unveiling it at a private ticketed event. There were protests to stop this event from happening, a private event. There were threats. We had gotten threats from the very beginning when we were saying we wanted to put our monument in Oklahoma. There were people saying they were going to tear it down. There were people who were going to bomb it. A commentator on Fox News on the Imus show named Bernard McGurk made a statement saying that we should be allowed to put our monument up and then we should be shot alongside of it and then they should take it down. Our lawyer contacted Fox, and Imus gave some kind of lame apology shortly thereafter. But that was the mood at the time. We got a good deal of death threats, and there was a lot of panic, seemingly around this notion that Baphomet would come to life and cannibalize people, steal children, or make milk spoil, and pregnant women miscarry, or whatever else. This was Pat Robertson's take on the entire affair.
You know, aren't you appalled? First of all, we say that being a homosexual is a constitutional right. Before that, we said that slaughtering unborn babies was a constitutional right. And now we want to unveil a statue of Satan in the midst of that economically plagued city. Can you believe that? Where are we heading? Isn't this what is going to bring the judgment of God upon us? You say, well, could we possibly be serving idols? Can we be sacrificing our babies to some heathen god? Is there something that we're going to be having ritual sacrifice on the state house lawn of some state? Are we going to be allowing this to happen? And while we're doing it, we'll be having polygamy and polyamory and all the other things that go along with a corrupt culture. Is that the way we're heading? Well, it looks like it is.
It's hard to disagree with everything he said about that. And I do think we're a harbinger of many of those things. Some of the wildest protest we had against us was when we were going to do an academic event at Harvard, and we were very clear with the student group that had organized this for us that We were going to be reenacting the idea of a black mass, but we were using it as an academic springboard to talk about how outgroups had been developed and how this pejorative label of Satanism had been applied to people just to justify their purges from society, and how that was something we were pushing back against. And that's part of the reason we think it's important to take on the name of Satan and Satanism at all, even being a non-theistic religion. We think that Satanism stands in contrast to the old, archaic, monarchical, feudalistic, Judeo-Christian kind of theocratic structure, and stands for Enlightenment values, sets a kind of mythological framework for a society based upon Enlightenment values, one that can be informed by science but still use art and metaphor to contextualize their daily lives. That went way over the head of the Archdiocese in Boston, of course. And when they heard that there was going to be a Black Mass ceremony taking place of any type, all the same people who couldn't be moved to say anything or take to the streets when the Boston Globe revealed the pedophilia scandal in the Archdiocese, they took to the streets to complain about an academic event at Harvard. And though many news reports I'm very skeptical of when they say people are protesting against us and they say there's hundreds of people, and I see only close-up photos of a few people and wonder if there were that many at all, I saw firsthand how many people flooded Harvard Square, and there were, it seemed, thousands of Catholics marching by the last venue that shut us down while I was sitting at the window doing an interview and trying to hide my face as they all kind of marched by. But I was amused to see that some of them were crying, because I'm cruel that way. That's a picture of me joining in a protest against me when I was in Arkansas for a subcommittee hearing related to our Baphomet monument going up. We have model legislation going around across the nation where people are using the same bill that failed ultimately in Oklahoma to put up Ten Commandments monuments on other public grounds. And in Arkansas, as I said, they're doing the same thing. We offered to put our monument on the public grounds. They said, we need to have a bill passed the same way the Ten Commandments bill was passed, and to do so, we needed a sponsor within the House or Senate. Well, to prove that this is still a discriminatory policy, we reached out to everybody in the House and Senate and asked them if they would sponsor our bill. And according to our expectations, thankfully, some of them were stupid enough to get back to us and say that they would never sponsor a bill because we're Satanists. And one member in the House or Senate got back and said that we could go to hell and we could quote her on that. And I thought, we will quote you, and we'll quote you in a federal lawsuit. That's viewpoint discrimination still. You can't turn it into a bureaucratic process and then claim somehow it's not viewpoint discrimination, but your request got lost in the shuffle. On the right, I just put that in because I'm kind of proud of it. Franklin Graham asked everybody to pray for me one day when he became aware of our after-school Satan Club. And our after-school Satan Clubs are meant to combat and contrast good news clubs put on by an organization called the Child Evangelism Fellowship. And they go into schools and they try to coerce children with candy and peer pressure to join their fundamentalist, isolationist, real biblical literalist way of thinking that indoctrinates children to believe that if they don't follow the doctrines of this evangelical group, that they will burn in hell. If you look them up, people have done analysis on their curriculum, and their curriculum is full of this kind of authoritarian conditioning. We were very clear that, in contrast, our clubs, which would be in the same clubs as the good news clubs, were there to offer people an alternative option, and we weren't speaking on items of religious opinion at all. We were going to be teaching critical thinking skills, and of course people asked, well, then why do you call it the After School Satan Club? And I said, well, because we're the fucking Satanic Temple, and I think it's fine. I think it's a good message to kids when they see people self-identifying as Satanists and being good, productive members of society, make them think twice about the witch hunts that could be concocted in the future and the ongoing satanic panic that takes place. Here was a petition put out by some Catholic group, it's funny that it was a Catholic group, almost 100,000 signatures. because the Good News Clubs put on by the Child Evangelism Fellowship is explicitly anti-Catholic. They're a Protestant group that's anti-Catholic, but for the most part, there's this kind of ecumenical unity that doesn't allow the different Christian factions right now to realize that they're not in agreement with one another on everything, because they're completely laser beam focused on certain particular issues like abortion and gay marriage. One of my favorites, though, was our Belle Plaine Memorial in Belle Plaine, Minnesota. The Freedom from Religion Foundation received a letter from a local complaining about a Christian monument that had gone up in a park. Nobody asked permission. Somebody just dumped it there, a cross with a kneeling soldier, and it was supposed to be in honor of veterans. And Freedom from Religion Foundation wrote to the city council, said, this is illegal, you have to take it down. City council took it down. The Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a litigious evangelical theocratic group, came in and worked with one of the locals to push to create an open forum, a free speech zone where other people could put monuments to veterans within certain parameters. That's the meaning of a limited free speech zone, that they can place parameters on what it's supposed to signify, but they can't engage in viewpoint discrimination, who's allowed to submit such a monument or whatever else. Well, we made a monument, or we applied for a monument, and it got approved, and suddenly the gusto left the Christians who were crying about having their monument placed back up, which had already been placed back up because they opened the free speech zone. People were protesting. Again, groups came and they marched and they held up signs not long before we were supposed to dump our monument on the grounds. And the Archdiocese sent a pastor, Brian Lynch, to speak at the city council meeting preceding all of this. And he was saying that the inverted pentagrams on the Satanic monument proposed by the Satanic Temple will prompt young people to consider Satanism for themselves and reject the good moral behavior required for an ordered and peaceful society. The monument may also attract pre-existing Satanists to our community as a place for theistic satanic ritual activities that victimize our children. He argued that this could lead to a form of grooming similar to that used by pedophiles. This grooming is intended, this is a quote, this grooming is intended to not only make children afraid to report the abuse they suffer at the hands of Satanists, but also to feel personally responsible for the evil they have suffered as youthful victims. Most disturbing is the fact that theistic satanic ritual activities are known to include deviant sexual acts with and among children. This was a Catholic priest saying this. That is what we call projective inversion. Well, here are our tenets. They're rather humanistic and broad, and this is the only kind of dictums we put upon our membership. One should strive to act with compassion and empathy towards all creatures in accordance with reason. The struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. One's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone, and we've actually litigated on grounds of personal autonomy in favor of reproductive rights, on the fact that that's a tenet of ours. The freedoms of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend, to willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forego your own. Belief should conform to our best scientific understanding of the world. We should take care to never distort scientific facts to fit our beliefs. People are fallible. If we make a mistake, we should do our best to rectify it and resolve any harm that may have been caused. Every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice should always prevail over the written or spoken word. So what's all the outrage about? Well, there's this idea of Satan as being the ultimate evil, and so must be an embodiment of cruelty and depravity. And why can't we just leave it at that? Why can't we just agree on the nature of a mythological character and not aggravate the Christian so? Well, the belief in Satan's servants on earth has never been benign, and it's been something that has caused a great deal of destruction historically through witch hunts, and many people, I think now, aren't as aware as they should be of the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. In the United States, people were being brought to trial on mere accusations of Satanism and even supernatural claims, and some of them spent a good deal of time in prison, had their families and lives absolutely destroyed. And furthermore, we have this notion attached, implicit in all of this, that the Judeo-Christian values have been the arbiter of what is morally correct throughout all of time, has never been wrong. In opposition to that is inherently evil. And I think that has not proven historically to be true. But watch, in say 50 years, we'll see that homosexuality is completely accepted, and we'll also see, I predict, that there will be a good deal of commentary about how churches were vital to seeing that change through, just in the same way they talk about slavery. I had written an op-ed in the Washington Post objecting to a minister's previous op-ed in the Washington Post claiming that the rise of white nationalism was satanic. I was pointing out how slavers had often deferred to the Bible, more than just often, and how the KKK is explicitly a Protestant sect. And there were op-eds about my op-ed saying that this was just so terribly wrong, and that Christianity did nothing but destroy the institution of slavery. Now, in the 1980s and the 1990s, the Satanic Panic had kind of been given rise by this fear of cults, the Jim Jones cult, which was actually a Christian cult, and their mass suicide, and this idea that only a return to old religious values could save the dissolution of the nuclear family and solve all the other social ills of the day. And there was a lot of deference to the Book of Revelations and other really bizarre conspiracy theories that kind of spiraled out of control. And people now kind of have a nostalgia for this when people are looking at backward masking in music and feel that it couldn't happen today. But there were some byproducts of this that still do persist today in a very harmful way. But this is the more kind of right-wing religious extremist material that people usually think of when they think of the Satanic Panic.
Watch out for 666. Watch out for 666. In a vision of the future, I saw in a vivid dream that the hour is soon coming when men will become machines. A new one world order will rise and then demand that all the world's people receive their scientific brand. I saw a tiny pre-programmed computer chip so thin, implanted in men's foreheads underneath their skin, linking all its bearers to the system's central brain. The master computer that over them will reign. Watch out for 666 and their computer chip that is designed to strip you on your self-control.
All right, now you're going to play this backwards.
Right. To get critics even, or the skeptics, to show them what I'm going to do, I've actually taken the exact piece of tape that you just heard it off of, and I've reverse thread the machine, and I'm going to play that exact piece of tape backwards now. Okay, just
Prove
to...
that you've not doctored
I
it
have
in
not
any way.
doctored it in any way. All right, let's go ahead and start. Okay.
I heard something there.
Parents, warning signs that might indicate a child's drift toward Satanism include abrupt emotional changes, changes in school habits, rejection of parental values.
You have eyewitnesses. For instance, one case, the parents were actually saw their child summon Dungeons and Dragons demons into his room before he killed himself.
Already recorded in the computers in Brussels, Belgium, the Common Market headquarters, which has computer capacity there to give a number to every man, woman, and child on the face of the whole world.
Is there anything occultic or dangerous about Smurfs?
First of all, you'll notice that they're depicted as blue with black lips.
Well, isn't that interesting?
And you know what happens to you when you die? You turn blue and your lips turn black.
In other words, these are depictive of dead creatures.
Right.
Try another piece. This is something I found the other day. See if you hear "The Lord Turn Me Off."
Now, can you plug Jesus Christ into a stage with bombs going, smoke blowing, hair teased up to the moon, and skin-tight spandex and leather, bouncing around with a bass guitar and rubbernecking while the crowd scream?
Unusual interest in books on Satanism, black magic, or witchcraft. Obsession with rock music groups using satanic symbols or references.
How has witchcraft made itself child-friendly?
Another thing is that Smurfs is an all-male community. And you say, oh, there's Smurfette. She's a female. Well, in one cartoon, she was depicted as transforming from a male to a female through magical power. And so the only female in the Smurfs is transformed from a male. She was not born a female.
No, what you're telling me then is that even Smurfs carry a homosexual connotation in that most of them are male.
I believe so.
There are people who will read the horoscope and never read the Word of God.
Will be programmed by this new technology. Those who take the number, their slaves will always be. So how can you for me if it's life and love you choose? Then you'll follow the truth, and that mark you will refuse. Watch out for 666 and their computer chip. That is beside you strip you of your self-control. Watch out for 666 and their computer chip. That is beside you strip you of your self-control. Don't sell your soul. Don't sell your soul. Watch out for 666.
So there was a lot of angst about the millennium, the forthcoming millennium at the end of the 20th century. But where the Satanic Panic really took off was when it kind of secularized, and you had this unholy alliance between some of the left and some of the right, where people were becoming aware more of child abuse and abuse towards women. And with that, the notion that any claim, no matter how bizarre, need to be taken at its face value. And after the book Sybil came out, related to multiple personality disorder and a woman who was supposed to have 16 different personalities, a story that's now been completely debunked, I would recommend the book Sybil Exposed. The therapist who worked with Sybil also believed quite vehemently in conversion therapy, claiming a 27% success rate on straightening out homosexuals through psychotherapy. But multiple personality diagnoses were kind of dependent upon recovered memory therapy, where people would speak to clients and try to divine the root of whatever melees they were suffering by exploring the depths of their mind for hidden or repressed memories. And what has been found is that this leads to a kind of collaborative effort, unwittingly sometimes, between the therapist and their client to come up with more and more bizarre stories of abuse. And in 1980, this book Michelle remembers came out. It was written by psychotherapist Lawrence Pazder, Lawrence Pazder, who wrote it in collaboration with Michelle Smith, who was his client, later became his wife, who he was hypnotizing and coming up with these grotesque stories of satanic abuse in which Satan actually appeared and abused her. He was Catholic, and some of the Catholic icons come into play. St. Michael, I think, showed up sometime in the book, made a guest appearance. And Jesus himself came down and removed her scars, and thus any corroborative evidence that any of this had happened. And this book was taken seriously and was a bestseller, and it appeared on Oprah and other such outlets. And it really caused an outbreak in this notion of satanic ritual abuse, which gained mainstream acceptance and talk shows at the time. I thought that this was isolated to the 80s and 90s, as most academics did, and that it kind of died out in around 1995 following a good number of lawsuits that called this kind of therapy into question and lost a lot of money for certain psychiatrists, until I went to a ritual abuse mind control conference around 2009 put out by an organization called Stop Mind Control and Ritual Abuse Today. It's a rather tortured acronym to turn that into SMART, but nonetheless, that's what they do. And at that conference, they were selling what I referred to as a higher evolution, barely higher evolution of the tinfoil hat, a shielding cap that would block those kinds of government weaponry that might control your mind, and also shielding socks in case they're trying to control your feet as well. And I would have no need to laugh at this or disparage this if it were just damaged people coming in and sharing these ideas with one another when they get up the courage to actually leave into this horrific world that they hold these crippling delusions about. But what really distressed me was that there were licensed mental health professionals there receiving continuing education units to talk about these things, and they're in effect propagating these crippling delusions to people who might be mentally vulnerable. The man who runs SMART is a man named Neil Brick. He's by his own account, he's a former mind-controlled Illuminati assassin who retrieved memories of having been sent child to commit murder, commit rapes, and do all kinds of depraved things. He's a licensed mental health professional in Massachusetts. Somebody affiliated with us now had sent in a complaint to his licensing board just based on the things he says publicly and how they're well outside of his field and how they're a danger to his potential clients. And Massachusetts claimed to have investigated this, and they got back to us with some non sequitur answer saying that, well, he doesn't seem to be drunk anymore, and nor does he seem to have multiple personality disorder anymore, so there's nothing wrong. And you could say that this is just a little fringe group, SMART, and Neil Brick isn't something to be really concerned about. But they were kept referring to a man named Colin Ross. First, here's a video of Neil Brick at one of his conferences where we had sent some of our people, and he had put a prohibition on people touching their faces, because when they talk of triggering within this community, they're not talking about the kind of flashback effect to traumatic events that certain topics bring up. They're speaking about mind control and how different government agencies or Satanists may have mind controlled you to act a certain way if you see certain gestures, certain color patterns, hear certain rhymes or whatever else. And Neil Brick has a very much exhibits a paranoia about people touching their faces. And in this video, he's threatening to have people thrown out of the conference he's speaking at if anybody touches their face again. Anyways, we don't have that much time. It's a very amusing video, though. If you go to the Gray Faction YouTube channel, you can see things like this. Colin Ross is who they refer to. He's kind of the expert, and he even manufactured the dissociative disorders interview scale that people use to diagnose dissociative disorders or multiple personality disorder. And when you read the dissociative disorders interview scale, it asks things about paranormal experiences, which might be legitimate questions for a psychiatrist to assess somebody's subjective beliefs, but it's very clear that Colin Ross believes in these things himself. He has spoken about exorcism, demonic possession. He was also saying that he had the paranormal power of emitting I-beams, and at one point had applied to win James Randi's $1 million paranormal challenge. When it was found that the electrodes were just picking up standard noise, Ross claimed that the testing variables were just absurd or whatever else. He wasn't wrong, of course. Alien abductions, whatever else. I'm hard-pressed to find something that Colin Ross doesn't actually believe. And he's a past president now of an organization called the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, which is a respected group for mental health professionals. They carry out annual conferences, and they give out continuing education units, and you'd be surprised at just how big and well-respected they are. But they also have a ritual abuse mind control special interest group that at one point was headed by a woman named Ellen Lachter. Ellen Lachter, this isn't from her slides, this is from the current head of that group, who believes in demonic possession and is very openly a Christian therapist. But Ellen Lachter believes in Illuminati plots. If you look at her website, endritualabuse.org or .com, she speaks about these things openly. She found rocks somewhere around her house, and of course this was all evidence of a grand conspiracy. She wants people to know that she's not so crazy as to think that there's one unified conspiracy trying to take over the world. There's several of them. She says this in many of her interviews as a way, I guess, to separate herself from the mere conspiracy theorists. There was a case in New York that particularly concerned us, and this was original research put on by, that was collected by the Satanic Temple and the Satanic Temple's Grey Faction, specifically dedicated to fighting pseudoscience and this form of psychiatric abuse. But Gigi Jordan, pictured here with her son, Jude Mira, was a multimillionaire mother in New York. She had some kind of pharmaceutical firm or some holdings in it that accounted for her wealth. Her child was severely autistic and could not verbally communicate anything. She first took the child to some dipshit therapist in Florida who used facilitated communication to get self-reporting from the child that the child had been horrifically abused by Satanists. And if you don't know anything about facilitated communication, it has long been debunked, and no mental health professional should be using such a technique. It's essentially the Ouija board technique. People hold the hands of the child and believe that they can divine subtle movements that tell them exactly where the child meant to type. When they do a blind study and the person who's doing the facilitating can't see the question, can't see the picture, whatever is called into question, or can't see the keyboard, they get gibberish, they get the wrong answers or whatever else. It doesn't work. But Gigi Jordan, then learning that her child had been abused by Satanists, came to believe that he wasn't autistic at all, but what he was manifesting was a result of that trauma. She then took the kid to Ellen Lachter, and though we don't know what happened in those sessions, we feel very strongly that if Gigi Jordan hadn't been able to have her delusions justified by a licensed psychiatrist or psychologist in California, maybe she wouldn't have murdered her kid, which she ended up doing. And she considered it a mercy killing because she was preserving him from suffering any more at the hands of this hidden satanic threat. We put out a petition to have this investigated and to have Ellen Lachter's licensure revoked by the California Board of Psychology. We said in part in this petition, we request that Ms. Lachter's possible cultivation of Gigi Jordan's filicidal delusions be investigated for suspicion of gross incompetence, if not abetment of murder, and that her mental competence be professionally evaluated. We are not interested in the testimony of Ms. Lachter's current or past clientele, as it seems a common element of conspiracism that the imagined revelation of an overarching delusional truth claim can be believed as freeing or healing, even while placing one in a subjective universe of suspicion, crippling fear, and hopeless withdrawal from reality. Again, Ms. Lachter's own professional materials are, in our opinion, self-evidently indicative of mental illness, and her competence as a mental health care professional insofar as her ability to act as an arbiter of rational truth claims are concerned. It is our opinion that evidence strongly suggests that Ms. Lachter's mental illness contributed to the murder of an 8-year-old child, Jude Michael Mira. We further contend that the very public nature of Mislackter's delusional claims, call into question the competence of the oversight processes that continue to allow her licensure. After some 9 months, the Board of Psychology wrote me back. You can read it, but it essentially says, fuck off. And that was that, and they think that's okay. We're still looking for ways to go about fighting this. I wish I had better news about the outcomes. We think now we might have to appeal to the Attorney General's office or look for legislation, perhaps state by state, or federal oversight about mental health care. But these are things we fight very strongly, and we fight against these witch hunts and pseudoscience, and we will continue to do those things as time goes on. And we could really use anybody's qualified help if they're interested in these topics and think they can help us along. We're going to be showing up next week in Chicago for the ISSTD conference. They should be expecting us by now. If it's not too far from you, feel free to participate. You'll get your free Gray Faction t-shirt. All you have to do is kind of be there and talk with some of the attendees. I'm going to be talking with them. I have several documentarians and members of media coming along, but we really think we can tip the scales if we make the public aware of how ludicrous this is and how potentially harmful it is to anybody, with anybody in their family or anybody themselves who might be mentally vulnerable, especially after a traumatic event, to go and find themselves in the hands of somebody like Ellen Lachter or Neil Brick. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Otherwise, he should be available after for a little bit if you want to come up and ask him personally. Got one right in the back.
All the way in the back. 2 things. First of all, as a point, you had one organization called SMART, which was crazy people. Just to let the audience know, there is an organization called Smart Recovery, which is a rational-based alternative to Alcoholics Anonymous. So not all smart people are bad.
Not all smart is dumb.
This is true. But I had the one question. You were talking about when it came to the repressed memory things. There was one person who they said Jesus came down and cured her of all the marks that the Satanists put on her.
Yeah, that was the book Michelle Remembers. And,
okay.
You look up Michelle Remembers, you can see it was a bestseller, and people took it seriously, and she was spoken to. Lawrence Pastor was spoken to on talk shows. But what was interesting is nobody really seemed to talk about those supernatural claims, which I think disqualifies it from rational conversation to begin with. And in 2011, I think it was, a book called 22 Faces came out, and I saw the same thing playing out. This book claimed to be a story of multiple personality disorder, this kind of rare condition, but it was full of these supernatural claims. I read it. It talked about psychic powers. It talked about exorcism. Jesus showed up in that book too. So I started writing to some of the members of the press who wrote about this book and asked them if they had actually read the book and if they understood what its contents were. And some of the people I was working with at that time, we worked to thoroughly debunk the author and the book. And I think we can be credited for it having kind of an abortive start in its marketing, especially because we hammered on Dr. Phil when he was going to have her on.
Well, the point I was trying to get to, though, was...
Oh, that wasn't your question. Okay.
No, yeah, that's okay. It was good information. But doesn't that make Jesus complicit with the horrid Satanists because he hid the marks that would have proved what happened? So, I mean, Christ was as much to blame then as anybody else.
I would hate to put Satan in collusion with those dastardly powers, but...
All right, we have time for one more question, if there is one.
Sure. So my question, I think the work you're doing against SMART and ISSTD is great, but with so many organizations and people out there doing harm, promoting pseudoscience, this and that, how did these two specifically come to your attention, and how do you choose which battles to fight?
Well, this is something I just kind of encountered. I mean, my affinity for Satanism really grew with the Satanic Panic when I was a kid and finding out that these things were false. And at the time I went to the SMART conference, I had the feeling that nobody was really advocating for the people who were destroyed by this. And I do see kind of the bigger picture here, where I kind of feel that this cultural mythological framework is destructive. This idea of Satan's servants on earth, this idea of Satan even as the ultimate evil, is arbitrary as people think that is, and as superfluous as people think that is. I think we have done one of the best things we can do for a culture when we take away that villain, that ultimate evil, and force people to look at people's real world deeds and consider alternate perspectives on certain things. So I just feel like I have a real place in that kind of battle, and I think this particular battle speaks so much to why it's important that we self-identify as Satanists at all.
All right, let's have another round of applause for Lucien.